You'll like this flock. We do the regular migrating twice a year, and then we take a lot of these side trips. They don't. Is that depending on the species of bird, they may travel by day and use landmarks. They may travel by night and use directions. And that's an issue when new buildings are put up. Is that in cities? It's been an issue with a new building and birds just slamming into the side of it in the dead of night and dropping in dead into the streets. And that's because they were night migrators and they were on a heading and apparently pretty much on automatic because they flew right into the side of a building. I guess the buildings are not necessarily lit, so they're not that easy to see in the dark. And these are not nocturnal birds. They're actually taking off in the daylight and landing in the daylight. But it's in their way. It got put up between the time they went back to wherever they came from and the time they headed back in the other direction. Social behavior. This is kind of associated with colonialism, with colonial biology. In species that live in groups, they are not necessarily exhibiting social behavior. Is that a group of gazelles hanging out on the African belt? Is that, yes, they associate in herds, and there are some interactions within the herds, but there's no real organization. And of course, the levels can vary. Is that some social groups are very loosely social, and some groups are very tightly social. Humans are very tightly social. Baboons are very tightly social. Ants are very tightly social. There's, ready for some lists? So I'm not gonna write this all down. So there are definite advantages to social behavior. One is defense. Now, this doesn't necessarily require a social group. The reason that, one of the reasons that gazelles hang out in herds is that they also get a defensive benefit from that. It's what they call a passive defensive benefit. And a passive defensive benefit is that, this happens at bird flocks too, is that when one member of the group detects a threat, they react. They're not planning on warning everybody else, but everybody else reacts to their reaction. So the birds all take off, or the gazelles all start running. And so group defensive behavior can be just reactionary. But a baboon posted as a lookout sees a snake in the grass or a leopard off in the distance, they are actively warning the group. In fact, they have different calls depending on what sort of threat it is. Is if they make the snake call, the adult baboons all stand up in the grass and start to scan around, looking in the grass for stuff. If they do the hawk call, then the big ones gather up the little ones and very often dash underneath something with them, or at least protect them, because the hawk's not taking out a full-grown baboon. But in smaller monkeys, they dash for the shelter of the bushes. Whereas the leopard call will gather them into a defensive group. So there can be active defense as well as passive defense. Reproduction, access to mates is increased in a social group. It's also increased in herding groups, but sometimes it's restricted in social groups, where not every member of the group gets access to reproduction. In some social groups, you get cooperation in protecting and raising the young. Happens in lions, hell, happens in mice, and mice are not particularly social. Finding food, building things in social groups that build things. Transmitting information is passing information through a group works better in a social group. Now the disadvantages can go with, you know how this works. The disadvantages are reflected in the advantages of non-social behavior. Species that don't group, that don't produce any kind of interactive group at all, and camouflage. Really tough to hide a group. Much easier to hide individual animals spread through the environment. Turns out that in times of food extremes, there's a disadvantage to being a group animal, is that because you're using all the food in a particular area, is that if the food levels drop quite a bit, you can use up all of your food and not migrate quickly enough to stay up with the needs of the group. When there's lots and lots of food, you're still only using the food in the area that your group is moving through. Maybe you'll migrate through a little bit faster, but a species that's widely distributed through the environment is both going to be able to survive less food and get the advantage of more food. Really good growth year is that you get things like locust swarms. That's not necessarily the best example, but locust swarms are able to do that. Reproductive, what they call exclusivity, is that when you have a social group and the females are ready to mate, there's a lot of males ready to mate with them. Whereas if you're spread through the environment, there's an excellent chance that when a male finds a female, he is not necessarily going to have to compete with other males for access. All depends on how powerful her advertising is, but you're much more likely to have exclusive access in a non-social environment than in a social environment. And there's what they call the carrying capacity. How many individuals of a particular species can an ecosystem support? And the carrying capacity is higher for non-social, spread through the environment groups than for social groups that are packed into groups, even several groups in the same ecosystem. So you can get much larger numbers. And keep in mind with insects, the carrying capacity can actually be hugely increased by insects that go through what they call indirect development, where the larval form occupies different niches than the adult forms. There's a carrying capacity for the little flippy mosquitoes that live in the water, and a carrying capacity for the adult mosquitoes that fly around and eat plant nectar. That's not necessarily social, non-social. In some cases, the social groups are considered, can be considered like they were all one organism. Remember I talked about how ants almost act like individual cells in a vast brain? Well, an organized group can act like a single individual, and they call those superorganisms. And then you get into group selection, which is, big controversial area of, does selection happen to the group as well as the individuals within the group? And is it for the individuals in service of the group or individuals in service of themselves? It's a whole thing. I've mentioned this before. Group selection was unfortunately used as a rationale for powerful civilizations to subjugate less powerful civilizations and kind of absorb their cultures and take Native American kids and take them away from their families and put them into American schools and basically erase the culture that they might have been raised in and substitute American cultures. Like, oh well, it's just evolution. It kind of sort of is, but it's not evolution that anybody with some morals really wanted to be a part of. But it definitely put the damper on the whole idea of group selection. Biologists went, nope, group selection, don't use it, it doesn't work. And that has held on for over 100 years since the initial kind of dropping of the concept. Okay, I think I'm going to stop there because there's a number of other things that'll tag together in the next block.